At 72, the world tells you your story is already written. For Harrison Caldwell, the final chapter looked like a brutal eviction and a one-way ticket to a homeless shelter. Then came the deed to a rotting, mosquito-choked swamp, a worthless wasteland that hid a $50 million secret beneath the mud. The eviction notice taped to apartment 4B did not care that Harrison Caldwell was 72 years old. It did not care that his knees popped like bubble wrap when he took the stairs, or that he had paid his rent on time every month for 28 years. The paper was a stark, neon-orange rectangle, screaming the inescapable truth. The building had been sold to a luxury development conglomerate, and Harrison's fixed pension was no longer enough to buy his right to exist in the city of Portland, Oregon. He stood in the hallway, staring at the notice, until the words blurred. The property manager, a sharply dressed 30-something named Gregory Langdon, had delivered it personally. Gregory had offered a tight, unsympathetic smile, muttered something about market rates and inevitable progress, and walked away, his leather shoes squeaking against the worn linoleum. Harrison had exactly 48 hours to pack away 7 decades of life. He didn't have much. His wife, Elliot, had passed away a decade prior, taking the warmth of the apartment with her. They had no children, only a collection of quiet memories captured in fading photographs. As Harrison loaded his meager belongings into a battered 1998 Ford Ranger, the Seattle-like drizzle soaked through his thin flannel jacket. He felt a profound, hollow exhaustion. He was an old man being erased. With his bank account hovering just above zero and the local shelters at full capacity, Harrison drove to a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, paying for 3 nights in advance. It was on the second day, while eating cold canned soup and staring at the peeling wallpaper, that the front desk clerk handed him an envelope. It had been forwarded from his old address, marked with the gold-embossed seal of a downtown law firm, Ross and Associates. Harrison tore it open. The letter inside was crisp, formal, and baffling. His estranged older brother, Leonard Caldwell, had died. Harrison hadn't spoken to Leonard in nearly 20 years. Leonard had always been a drifter, an eccentric paranoid who trusted nobody and lived off the grid, chasing phantom gold rushes and investing in bizarre, doomed ventures. The letter requested Harrison's immediate presence at the office of an attorney named Evelyn Ross to discuss Leonard's last will and testament. A spark of desperate hope ignited in Harrison's chest. Perhaps Leonard had struck it rich. Perhaps out of some lingering sense of familial duty, his brother had left him enough money to secure a small apartment, or at least keep him out of the cold. The next morning, Harrison sat in a sleek, glass-walled conference room high above downtown Portland. Evelyn Ross, a pragmatic attorney with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, slid a thick manila folder across the polished mahogany table. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Caldwell," Evelyn said softly. "Your brother passed away 2 weeks ago in a county hospital in Nevada. As you are his only surviving relative, he named you as the sole beneficiary of his estate." Harrison leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly. Did he leave anything behind? A savings account, life insurance? Evelyn sighed, offering a sympathetic, pitying look that made Harrison's stomach drop. "I'm afraid Leonard died with considerable debt. The hospital bills consumed what little cash he had. However, there is one asset remaining, a piece of real estate he purchased back in the late 1980s. She opened the folder and extracted a faded, notarized deed. 40 acres of land in rural Tillamook County, right on the Oregon coast, Evelyn explained. It's entirely paid off. It's yours now. Harrison took the paper. 40 acres. The sheer size of it sounded impressive. Land on the Oregon coast could be incredibly valuable. For a brief, dizzying moment, he imagined selling the parcel to developers, taking the cash and living out his remaining years in comfort. "Can I sell it?" Harrison asked, his voice thick with emotion. "You can certainly try," Evelyn replied, though her tone was cautious. "But I must be completely transparent with you, Mr. Caldwell. We had a county appraiser look at the parcel last week. The land is problematic. It's zoned as undevelopable wetland. It's completely saturated, prone to severe flooding, and lacks any utility hookups. The appraiser valued the entire 40 acres at less than $4,000. It's essentially a swamp." The flicker of hope was extinguished, leaving behind a cold, dark dread. A swamp. A useless, worthless tract of mud and water. "I have nowhere else to go," Harrison whispered, more to himself than to the lawyer. "I understand this isn't the windfall you might have hoped for," Evelyn said gently. "But it is yours. You own it free and clear. If nothing else, it's a place to park your truck while you figure things out." 2 days later, with his motel funds exhausted, Harrison drove his heavily loaded Ford Ranger west toward the coast, winding through the dense, fog-shrouded forests of the Coast Range. The GPS coordinates led him off the main highway, down a series of increasingly narrow, unpaved logging roads, until the road simply ended at a rusted chain strung between 2 mossy Douglas firs. A weathered wooden sign hung from the chain, bearing the faded words, "Private property. Keep out." Harrison unhooked the chain and drove his truck down a muddy, overgrown path. When he finally broke through the tree line, he slammed on the brakes and stared through the rain-streaked windshield. Evelyn Ross hadn't exaggerated. If anything, she had been generous. Before him stretched a desolate grey expanse of brackish water, thick reeds and sinking mud banks. The air smelled of rotting vegetation, sulphur and salt. Dead skeletal trees poked out of the murky water like accusing fingers. Swarms of aggressive mosquitoes immediately began to bounce against his truck windows. There was only one piece of dry ground, a slight elevation near the edge of the property, upon which sat the collapsed, rotting remains of an old duck-hunting blind. The wood was black with decay, the roof mostly caved in. Harrison stepped out of the truck. His boots immediately sank 2 inches into the foul-smelling muck. The cold coastal wind cut right through his flannel jacket, chilling him to his brittle bones. He was 72 years old, standing in the middle of nowhere, with $20 in his pocket and a rotting swamp to his name. He leaned against the hood of his truck, buried his face in his calloused hands, and for the first time since he was a young boy, he openly wept. He wept for Elliot. He wept for his lost apartment. And he wept for the bitter, cruel joke that was his inheritance. Survival leaves no room for self-pity. As the afternoon light began to fade into a bruised purple twilight, the dropping temperature forced Harrison to move. If he stayed out in the coastal wind, he would catch pneumonia, and out here, pneumonia was a death sentence. He pulled a heavy blue tarp from the bed of his truck, along with a rusted hammer and a box of nails he had salvaged from his apartment. Trudging through the sucking mud to the ruined hunting blind, he assessed the structure. 3 walls were still marginally intact, though leaning precariously. He spent the next 3 agonizing hours clearing out decades of accumulated rot-dead leaves and animal droppings. His joints screamed in protest, his back locking up in painful spasms, but he pushed through. By nightfall, he had managed to nail the tarp over the caved-in roof, creating a rudimentary wind-blocking shelter. He set up his camping cot inside, wrapped himself in every blanket he owned, and listened to the terrifying symphony of the swamp, the chorus of frogs, the splash of unseen predators in the dark water, and the relentless driving rain beating against the tarp. For the next 3 weeks, Harrison's life devolved into a grueling, primitive routine. He drove into the nearest town, a depressed logging community, called Nehalem, once a week. to buy rice-canned beans and bottled water with the last of his Social Security check. He collected driftwood to build small fires, boiling swamp water to wash his clothes. The physical toll was immense. He lost 15 pounds he couldn't afford to lose. His hands became permanently stained with dark peat and mud covered in minor cuts that refused to heal in the damp environment. But strangely, amidst the misery, a stubborn resilience began to take root in his mind. He was still breathing. He was still fighting. This miserable patch of earth was trying to kill him, but he refused to grant it the satisfaction. Then came the storm. Meteorologists called it an atmospheric river, a massive, concentrated band of moisture off the Pacific Ocean. It slammed into the Oregon coast with hurricane-force winds and torrential rain. Harrison spent 2 days and 2 nights trapped inside his fragile shelter, clinging to the wooden support beams as the wind howled like a wounded animal. The swamp swelled the dark water, rising inches an hour, threatening to swallow the small rise of land his shelter sat upon. The noise was deafening, the cracking of dead trees, the roaring of the wind, the heavy thud of mudbanks giving way. Harrison prayed quietly in the dark, certain that the earth would simply open up and swallow him whole. On the morning of the 3rd day, the storm broke. The rain ceased, leaving behind a thick, eerie coastal fog. Harrison pushed his way out from beneath the sagging tarp. He was soaked to the bone, shivering violently, but alive. The landscape, however, had been drastically altered. The torrential floodwaters had scoured the swamp, tearing away massive sections of the peat bogs and reshaping the mudbanks. A steep embankment about 50 yards from his camp, a hill of dense, compacted mud and tangled roots had completely collapsed, shearing off to reveal the dark earth beneath. Harrison cautiously made his way toward the mudslide to assess the damage, using a thick branch as a walking stick to test the stability of the ground. As he neared the collapsed bank, his boot caught on something hard and unforgiving beneath the fresh layer of slurry. He stumbled, falling to his knees in the cold muck. Cursing softly, he looked down, expecting to see a large rock or a piece of a submerged tree trunk. Instead, he saw a dull gray edge of metal. Frowning, Harrison wiped the mud away with his gloved hand. The metal was smooth, curved, and unnaturally thick. It wasn't scrap from a tractor, and it wasn't a piece of logging equipment. It looked industrial. Heart pounding with sudden, inexplicable adrenaline, he grabbed his walking stick and began to dig into the soft, wet earth around the object. He dug for an hour, ignoring the burning ache in his shoulders. The more mud he moved, the larger the object became. It was a massive cylindrical structure, buried horizontally deep within the embankment. The storm had washed away just enough of the hillside to expose the top arc of the cylinder. Breathing heavily, Harrison went back to his truck and retrieved his rusted shovel. He worked furiously, a strange manic energy gripping him. Who buries a massive metal cylinder in the middle of an impassable swamp? By noon, he had cleared a section roughly 4 feet wide. He scraped the last layer of thick clay off the metal surface, revealing a line of heavy oxidized rivets. But it was what lay in the center of the exposed metal that made Harrison's breath catch in his throat. It was a hatch, a circular submarine-style hatch secured by a massive rusted wheel lock in the center. The metal around the hatch was engraved with faded, barely legible letters. Harrison leaned in, tracing the deep grooves with a trembling, mud-caked finger. U.S. Gov property of the Department of the Treasury, 1934. Harrison stared at the words, his mind racing. 1934. The Department of the Treasury. Why would a government vault from the Great Depression be buried in his brother's worthless swamp? He grabbed the heavy iron wheel of the hatch. He expected it to be rusted solid, fused together by nearly a century of damp earth. He planted his boots in the mud, gripped the wheel with both hands, and threw his entire meager body weight into it, gritting his teeth as pain flared in his lower back. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deafening metallic crack that echoed across the silent swamp, the seal broke. A sharp hiss of pressurized air escaped from the seams, blowing a cloud of ancient dust and stale air into Harrison's face. The smell was distinct, dry metallic, and completely devoid of the swamp's rot. The inside of this cylinder had been hermetically sealed for decades. Trembling, Harrison gripped the heavy handle, planted his feet, and heaved the iron door open, staring into the pitch-black abyss below. Harrison ran back to his truck, sliding wildly in the thick mud. He grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight and practically dragged himself back to the exposed metal hatch. His heart pounded frantically. He knelt by the dark opening, shining the bright beam into the abyss. The light pierced the ancient darkness, revealing a vertical steel ladder descending 20 feet into a wide, concrete-reinforced bunker. The air rushing out smelled faintly of machine oil and dry paper. Harrison took a deep breath, gripped the rusted rungs, and began the precarious climb downward. Every muscle burned, but adrenaline masked the pain. When his boots finally struck the solid floor, the sound echoed down a long, metallic corridor. He swept the flashlight beam around. The walls were lined with thick cables and heavy fuse boxes. This was a deliberate, highly engineered subterranean vault. He walked slowly down the corridor, his footsteps kicking up small clouds of dust. At the far end stood a secondary security door, a massive slab of solid steel. Miraculously, the heavy locking mechanism was disengaged, likely left open by whoever sealed the hatch a century ago. Harrison pushed against the steel, groaning as the hinges protested loudly. The room beyond was expansive, measuring roughly 40 by 40 feet. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating rows of heavy wooden crates stacked meticulously on wooden pallets. The crates were perfectly preserved in the hermetically sealed environment. Harrison approached the nearest stack. Stenciled across the wood in faded black ink were the words, "Federal Reserve Bureau authorized by H. Morgenthau Jachter, Project Golden Eagle, 1934. Harrison's breath caught. He recognized the name. Henry Morgenthau Jr. was the Secretary of the Treasury under President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In 1934, rumors persisted that the Treasury hid emergency gold reserves nationwide. With shaking hands, Harrison wedged the rusted head of his shovel under the lid of the top crate and pried. The dry wood splintered with a sharp crack, snapping the fragile metal banding. He pushed the heavy lid aside and aimed the flashlight inside. Beneath a thick layer of waxed canvas lay neat, gleaming rows of solid gold bullion. The bars were stamped with the official seal of the United States Mint and the year 1934. The dull, mesmerizing luster reflected the beam, casting a warm glow across his face. He reached out, touching the cold surface. It weighed roughly 27 pounds. In this single crate alone, there were 20 bars, and there were dozens of crates in the room. He stumbled backward, his mind struggling to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the discovery. He was standing in a vault containing tens of millions of dollars in untraceable historical gold. His brother, Leonard, had known. Leonard's wild conspiracy theories, his obsession with buying this useless, sinking swamp, his refusal to sell it, despite living in crushing poverty. It all made sense. Leonard had somehow acquired the geographical coordinates of the hidden bunker years ago, but the swamp's treacherous shifting terrain and constant flooding had prevented him from ever pinpointing the exact location of the buried hatch. It took a freak, century-level atmospheric river and a catastrophic mudslide to finally tear the earth away and reveal the government's forgotten secret. Harrison sat heavily on a wooden crate, overwhelmed by a dizzying wave of emotion. Just a month ago, He was a discarded old man, thrown out onto the street by a ruthless corporate landlord. He had been stripped of his dignity, his home, and his future. Now he possessed a massive fortune. He laughed a raw, tearful sound that echoed loudly in the subterranean silence. He was no longer a victim. He was a king in a kingdom of mud. But as he sat there wiping the tears from his filthy cheeks, a sudden chilling sound pierced the quiet dampness of the vault. It was a sound that did not belong in the swamp, the low guttural rumble of a heavy-duty diesel engine, followed immediately by the harsh slam of a vehicle door up on the surface. Harrison quickly killed the flashlight, plunging the entire vault into absolute blackness. He gripped the wooden handle of his shovel, his calloused knuckles turning completely white under the strain. He crept slowly toward the dark corridor, navigating strictly by memory, and began the agonizing climb up the rusted steel ladder. As he neared the top rung, he peeked cautiously over the lip of the exposed metal hatch. Through the lingering morning fog rolling across the water, he saw two massive black SUVs parked aggressively on the small patch of dry land near his collapsed shelter. 4 men, clad in expensive tactical rain gear, were fanning out across the treacherous mud holding assault rifles. Standing by the lead vehicle, holding a highly sophisticated radar tablet, was a sickeningly familiar face. It was Gregory Langdon, the sharply dressed property manager who had callously handed him his eviction notice back in Portland. Beside Gregory stood a tall, imposing figure, possessing silver hair and cold, predatory eyes. This was Vincent Gallagher, the ruthless billionaire CEO of Onyx Horizon Holdings, the massive corporate conglomerate that had purchased Harrison's modest apartment building. The terrifying pieces of the puzzle suddenly slammed into place with absolute, undeniable clarity. The brutal eviction had not been a random act of corporate greed or gentrification. Onyx Horizon Holdings had been aggressively hunting for the legendary Morgenthau bunker for years, utilizing limitless resources. They must have discovered Leonard Caldwell's ownership of this specific land parcel and waited patiently for the eccentric drifter to die. When the property legally passed to Harrison, they deliberately orchestrated his immediate eviction, explicitly aiming to bankrupt the elderly man and force him into selling the entire 40 acres for mere pennies. When Harrison stubbornly chose to live in the freezing swamp instead of selling, they grew frustrated and impatient. The catastrophic atmospheric storm had ultimately forced their hand. Their expensive orbital satellites must have detected the massive mudslide and the newly exposed metallic anomaly jutting prominently from the earth. "Check the mudslide," Vincent Gallagher's arrogant voice barked across the stagnant water, slicing violently through the heavy coastal fog. "The ground-penetrating radar indicates a massive subterranean void located right under that recently collapsed ridge. Find the entrance before the pathetic old man wakes up. If he resists, simply drown him in the bog and make it look like a tragic accident." Harrison's blood instantly ran completely cold within his veins. They were absolutely going to murder him without a single second of hesitation. He was exactly 72 years old, physically exhausted, chronically malnourished, and vastly outnumbered by highly trained, heavily armed corporate mercenaries. He absolutely could not fight them in a direct, physical combat scenario. However, Harrison possessed one singularly crucial tactical advantage that they completely lacked. They were wealthy strangers operating blindly in a deeply hostile, wildly unpredictable environment, foolishly relying on glowing screens and digital maps. Harrison, conversely, had spent the last 3 agonizing weeks physically surviving the brutal, completely unforgiving and deadly reality of the harsh wetland. He intimately knew every treacherous, incredibly deep sinkhole, every highly unstable wet mud bank, and every completely hidden deep water channel. Harrison quietly slipped completely out of the underground hatch, desperately keeping his aching body pressed tightly against the freezing, intensely dark earth. He crawled agonizingly through the remarkably thick, unbelievably sharp reeds, moving completely silently, like a ghost haunting the sprawling marsh. He slowly reached his heavily rusted truck and silently pulled open the heavy driver's side door, sharply wincing at the faint metallic squeak. He deliberately did not insert the key to start the incredibly loud internal engine. Instead, he reached blindly under the extremely worn fabric seat and pulled out a remarkably heavy, exceptionally bright orange emergency marine flare gun he had recently purchased in the tiny town. He also quickly grabbed his exceptionally old, completely reliable hunting rifle, a treasured remnant from his distant youth that he had meticulously kept thoroughly wrapped in an oiled rag securely stored behind the front truck seat. It strictly held only 3 rifle rounds, but it was profoundly enough to make a definitive, highly resounding, violent statement to the heavily armed corporate intruders. "Sir," Gregory Langdon suddenly yelled at the absolute top of his lungs, wildly pointing toward the totally exposed metallic hatch prominently protruding from the nearby hillside. "Over here." The soft earth gave way entirely. There is a massive military-grade steel hatch securely located exactly right here. Vincent Gallagher smiled widely, revealing a profoundly cruel, deeply triumphant facial expression on his exceedingly aristocratic face. "Absolutely excellent work, Gregory. Secure the immediate muddy perimeter. Get the heavy portable diesel generator and the heavy industrial cutting torches totally ready immediately." Harrison stepped bravely out from behind his deeply rusted motor truck, firmly planting his filthy, muddy leather boots onto a remarkably solid, dense patch of highly elevated, wildly tangled tree roots. He rapidly raised the heavy wooden hunting rifle closely to his frail shoulder, purposefully aiming the long steel barrel directly at the incredibly soft, overly muddy ground, strictly located mere tiny inches near Vincent's incredibly expensive imported leather boots, and firmly pulled the metal trigger. The incredibly loud, deafening gunshot immediately shattered the incredibly serene, still morning silence of the exceedingly murky swamp, violently echoing exactly like a massive military cannon blast echoing across the cold, dark water. The highly paid, incredibly heavily armed corporate mercenaries immediately scrambled, dropping incredibly rapidly to the brutally freezing wet mud and frantically drawing their incredibly sophisticated, modern automatic weapons in a frantic state of completely blind, sheer, utter tactical panic. Vincent Gallagher froze, completely, perfectly solid instantly, intensely staring with absolute, completely profound, deeply unadulterated shock, exactly at the incredibly physically frail, remarkably exhausted elderly man standing quite proudly, defiantly, entirely alone within the actively swirling, incredibly freezing, damp morning mist. "That is strictly private property you are illegally trespassing on, Gallagher," Harrison yelled loudly, his raspy voice powerfully carrying the profound, undeniable, absolute heavy weight of a desperate old man who possessed absolutely, strictly nothing left to lose. Vincent heavily narrowed his exceedingly cold eyes. "Take him down now." The heavily armed men advanced blindly. Suddenly, the lead tactical mercenary took 3 rapid steps and plunged entirely waist-deep directly into a completely hidden, freezing peat sinkhole, screaming wildly. Harrison instantly raised the orange marine flare gun, carefully aiming it squarely at the completely dead canopy of an incredibly ancient, highly flammable, resin-soaked cedar tree leaning directly over their remaining vehicle. He fired. The tree exploded into towering, intense orange flames. Panicking utterly, the defeated syndicate wildly fled forever. The bog was truly his impenetrable, absolute fortress now. Did Harrison's incredible discovery leave you speechless? Sometimes The greatest treasures are hidden in the places we least expect, waiting for someone strong enough to weather the storm. If you loved this thrilling tale of survival, hidden fortunes, and sweet justice, please hit that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life mysteries and dramatic adventures. What would you do